Trump's decision to step back from the Ukrainian war was not made impulsively, nor was it a gesture of isolationism. It was a cold calculation. Washington has reached the point where the cost of sustaining Kiev outweighs any strategic advantage gained from it. What began as a political commitment to defend democracy has degenerated into a war with no clear objective, no viable end state, and no realistic path to victory. Trump has recognized something. His predecessors refused to admit Ukraine was never going to defeat Russia without direct NATO intervention. And Washington has neither the resources nor the political will to make that happen. This is the breaking point. The moment the United States begins to quietly walk away from a conflict it once claimed as central to the defense of the West, the political language around this decision will be carefully managed, but the underlying message is unmistakable. Washington is no longer willing to carry the financial, military, and diplomatic burden of Kiev's survival. Trump's team understands that continuing to feed the war machine in Ukraine means bleeding away resources that are needed elsewhere. The Pacific, the domestic economy, and internal political stability. It is no longer a matter of choice. It's a matter of strategic triage. The American defense establishment has stretched itself thin, juggling simultaneous pressures from China, Iran, and a fractured domestic landscape. The notion that Washington can sustain an indefinite proxy war against Russia while containing China is no longer credible. Trump's approach is pragmatic, not moral. He sees Ukraine as a battlefield that was never truly America's war. From the beginning, the U.S. commitment was built on the assumption that Russia would be weakened, isolated, and forced to compromise. That didn't happen. Instead, Russia adapted, dug in, and outlasted Western expectations. The much-hyped Ukrainian counteroffensives collapsed into stalemate and attrition. Europe's economic strength faltered. The American public's support eroded. The war became not a display of American strength, but a reminder of its strategic limits. Trump's withdrawal from Kiev is therefore not a gesture of weakness. It is an admission that the U.S. no longer wants to subsidize someone else's losing war. This is a decisive turning point for Europe. For 2 years, European leaders comforted themselves with the illusion that Washington would never abandon the fight. They built their political strategies, their military aid packages, and their public messaging around American leadership. That assumption is now crumbling as Washington pulls back. The weight of the war shifts across the Atlantic. Brussels, Berlin, and Paris will have to face a reality they've avoided since the war began. They are on their own. The shift will not happen overnight. It will begin quietly. Fewer weapons, less financial aid, less political pressure on Moscow. But over time, the message will become unavoidable. The United States is stepping away from a conflict it can no longer afford for Europe. This is the beginning of an entirely new phase of the War I, where the shield of American power no longer guarantees their position, and where they must either face Russia directly or accept the strategic consequences of their limits. Every war reaches a point where the sides involved stop pretending that negotiation can bridge the distance between their demands. Ukraine has been at that point for months. Trump and his team understand something European leaders have tried to ignore: the gap between Moscow's objectives, Kiev's survival, and Europe's illusions is not political, it's structural. Russia will not abandon the territories it has annexed. Ukraine, as it stands, cannot recover them. And Europe lacks the means to force Moscow to do anything. This is why Trump concluded that no amount of U.S. mediation, no additional weapon packages, and no political pressure campaign will alter the core reality of the war. There is no deal to be made that satisfies all sides simultaneously. From Moscow's perspective, the outcome is already decided. The Russian leadership views the annexed territories as permanently integrated into the Russian Federation. This is not a bargaining chip, not a temporary occupation to be traded at the negotiating table. It is the foundation of their war effort. To accept anything less would be to concede defeat. Kiev, meanwhile, is bound by its own political reality. Any Ukrainian leader who openly surrenders territory risks losing not just power, but legitimacy. Europe is caught in the middle of these irreconcilable positions, talking about peace while refusing to face what peace would actually require, accepting Russian territorial control and recognizing a permanently altered map. Trump's calculation is rooted in this impasse. He knows that U.S. diplomacy cannot conjure a solution where none exists. He also knows that dragging out the war will only deepen the divide between Europe's public rhetoric and its actual capabilities. European leaders promise total support for Kiev, but they cannot deliver total victory. They talk about negotiations, but they cannot bridge the chasm between Russian and Ukrainian demands. Trump's instinct is to step out of the deadlock entirely, to remove the United States from a conflict that has no achievable political end state. The result is a strategic vacuum. By stepping back, Trump forces Europe to face what it has avoided: owning the war politically and materially. As long as Washington remained at the table, European governments could hide behind American power, pretending that negotiations might one day resolve everything on their terms. With that cover gone, they must either accept a deeply uncomfortable settlement or continue a war they cannot win alone. This is the essence of the impasse, and it is the reason Trump is walking away. For all the talk of diplomacy and peace conferences, no agreement can satisfy Moscow, Kiev, and Brussels at once. And Trump, unlike many European leaders, has no interest in pretending otherwise. When Washington steps away, Europe inherits the war. It's that simple. For nearly 2 years, Brussels and the major European capitals have played their role with one critical assumption in place: the United States would always remain the strategic backbone of the war effort. Now, that assumption has been shattered. Trump's withdrawal leaves Europe with the political burden, the economic cost, and the strategic risk of facing Russia alone. And for a continent that has allowed its defense structures to atrophy for decades, This is not a shift of responsibility. It's a shock to the system. Europe was never prepared to lead this war. It lacks both the military capacity and the political cohesion to match the scale of the challenge. NATO may be headquartered in Brussels, but it has always functioned as an American-led structure. U.S. forces, U.S. logistics, U.S. intelligence, and U.S. strategic direction have been the engine of every operation. When Washington steps back, that engine stops. What remains is a fractured coalition of states with competing interests, uneven military capabilities, and fragile domestic support for escalation. Countries like Poland and the Baltic states will push for confrontation. Germany and France will talk about strategic autonomy but lack the force to back it up. Southern Europe will quietly look for the exit. The economic dimension is just as unforgiving. Europe's war effort has depended on American industrial power. U.S. defense production has filled the gaps in Europe's anemic stockpiles. American energy exports have cushioned the shock of losing Russian gas. American financial systems have kept Kiev afloat. With Trump pulling the plug, these lifelines will begin to thin. Europe will have to find the money, weapons, and political will to keep Ukraine standing, a task for which it is simply not structurally built. The European Union may talk about long-term commitments, but the reality is that most European governments are already struggling to sustain what they have pledged. Politically, the cracks are already visible. European societies are showing fatigue. Protest movements against military spending and energy inflation are growing. Populist parties are capitalizing on the perception that the war is an American project, not a European one. Once Washington steps away, European leaders will no longer be able to deflect responsibility. Every setback on the battlefield will be theirs. Every economic shock will land squarely on their own governments. This is the weight they have spent 2 years avoiding, and it's about to land on them in full. This is what makes Trump's decision so consequential. He's not just withdrawing support, he's stripping away Europe's political cover. Without U.S. leadership, the alliance is no longer truly an alliance. It's a collection of states confronting a great power alone. For the first time since the end of the Cold War, Europe must decide whether it can fight a war without America or accept the geopolitical consequences of losing it. From the very beginning, European leaders have built their political strategy around a single story that Ukraine could hold the line against Russia and eventually prevail. It was a convenient narrative. It justified pouring money and weapons into Kiev. It kept public opinion in check. And it allowed Europe to avoid asking the hard questions about its own military and economic capacity. But with Washington stepping back, that narrative collapses. The illusion of winning was always contingent on American power, on U.S. logistics, U.S. intelligence, and U.S. financial muscle. Without that foundation, the rhetoric in Brussels, Berlin, and Paris begins to ring hollow. Europe's leaders know this, even if they can't admit it publicly. On the battlefield, Ukraine is not winning. It's losing manpower at unsustainable rates. Its infrastructure is being degraded systematically. Its industrial base has been bombed, blockaded, or hollowed out. The so-called counteroffensives have not achieved strategic breakthroughs. They've exposed the limits of Western support. European stockpiles are already near empty. The promised surges of production are months or years away. What remains is a political performance declarations of unwavering support, hollow talk of strategic patience, and an insistence that the tide will somehow turn. It won't. The problem for Europe is that illusions are easy to maintain when America is carrying the heavy load. They are much harder to sustain when reality lands at your own doorstep. Energy costs remain high. Industrial decline is accelerating, and populations are increasingly skeptical of endless war spending. With Trump withdrawing U.S. backing, every shortfall, every defeat, and every escalation will be laid at the feet of European leaders themselves. Their ability to spin the war as a righteous, winnable struggle will erode quickly once their citizens realize that the American shield is gone. This is not the first time a great power bloc has tried to disguise strategic weakness with optimistic narratives. The British and French did it in the interwar period. The Soviets did it in Afghanistan, and now Europe is doing it with Ukraine. Illusions can delay the reckoning. Trump's withdrawal leaves Europe with the political burden, the economic cost, and the strategic risk of facing Russia alone. And for a continent that has allowed its defense structures to atrophy for decades, this is not a shift of responsibility. It's a shock to the system. Europe was never prepared to lead this war. It lacks both the military capacity and the political cohesion to match the scale of the challenge. NATO may be headquartered in Brussels, but it has always functioned as an American-led structure. U.S. forces, U.S. logistics, U.S. intelligence, and U.S. strategic direction have been the engine of every operation. When Washington steps back, that engine stops. What remains is a fractured coalition of states with competing interests, uneven military capabilities, and fragile domestic support for escalation. Countries like Poland and the Baltic states will push for confrontation. Germany and France will talk about strategic autonomy but lack the force to back it up. Southern Europe will quietly look for the exit. The economic dimension is just as unforgiving. Europe's war effort has depended on American industrial power. U.S. defense production has filled the gaps in Europe's anemic stockpiles. American energy exports have cushioned the shock of losing Russian gas. American financial systems have kept Kiev afloat. With Trump pulling the plug, these lifelines will begin to thin. Europe will have to find the money, weapons, and political will to keep Ukraine standing, a task for which it is simply not structurally built. The European Union may talk about long-term commitments, but the reality is that most European governments are already struggling to sustain what they have pledged. Politically, the cracks are already visible. European societies are showing fatigue. Protest movements against military spending and energy inflation are growing. Populist parties are capitalizing on the perception that the war is an American project, not a European one. Once Washington steps away, European leaders will no longer be able to deflect responsibility. Every setback on the battlefield will be theirs. Every economic shock will land squarely on their own governments. This is the weight they have spent 2 years avoiding, and it's about to land on them in full. This is what makes Trump's decision so consequential. He's not just withdrawing support, he's stripping away Europe's political cover. Without U.S. leadership, the alliance is no longer truly an alliance. It's a collection of states confronting a great power alone. For the first time since the end of the Cold War, Europe must decide whether it can fight a war without America or accept the geopolitical consequences of losing it. From the very beginning, European leaders have built their political strategy around a single story that Ukraine could hold the line against Russia and eventually prevail. It was a convenient narrative. It justified pouring money and weapons into Kiev. It kept public opinion in check. And it allowed Europe to avoid asking the hard questions about its own military and economic capacity. But with Washington stepping back, that narrative collapses. The illusion of winning was always contingent on American power, on U.S. logistics, U.S. intelligence, and U.S. financial muscle. Without that foundation, the rhetoric in Brussels, they are not prepared to carry for the EU as a whole. It means the end of the illusion that European power flows naturally from American commitment. Moscow understands Trump's posture well. Russian strategists have long argued that the U.S. has no vital interest in sustaining an unwinnable war in Eastern Europe. If Washington steps back, Russia faces a fragmented Europe rather than a transatlantic bloc. That's a far easier strategic problem for the Kremlin to manage. Trump's calculation is simple. Why keep paying for a confrontation that benefits no one in Washington except defense contractors and career bureaucrats? By pulling away, he is forcing Europe to face the geopolitical reality it spent 3 decades avoiding. This is not a tactical shift. It's a reordering of the map. If Trump holds to this course, Europe will be forced to choose between escalation it cannot afford or accommodation it does not want. Either way, the age of unquestioned U.S. leadership in Europe is ending. Europe is about to discover the true weight of a war it never fully controlled. For 2 years, American power shielded European governments from the economic and strategic costs of their own rhetoric. Washington supplied the weapons, underwrote the financing, provided the intelligence, and projected the illusion of unity, and Trump's retreat strips all of that away. What's left is the hard reality of Europe's limited capacity to sustain a war against a major power. The economic burden alone is staggering. Energy prices remain high. Inflation continues to eat into household budgets and industrial output, especially in Germany. The supposed engine of Europe has weakened to levels not seen in decades. A war that was politically convenient when America was paying the bill is now a domestic liability. Europe's defense industry simply isn't built for this kind of conflict. Decades of underinvestment left production lines hollow. Attempts to scale up in response to the war have been slow, fragmented, and bogged down by bureaucracy, European stockpiles are dangerously thin, and every shipment to Ukraine leaves their own forces less prepared. Replacing these weapons isn't a matter of months, it's a matter of years. That's the gap Trump understands. Well, Europe talks about strategic autonomy, but it lacks the material foundation to make that talk real. As the U.S. pulls away, the entire military supply chain begins to strain under its own weight. The financial burden is no less severe. European states are already shouldering massive energy subsidies to keep their populations from turning against the war. They've poured tens of billions of euros into Ukraine, much of it financed through debt. That might be politically tolerable with U.S. support, but without it, the pressure on national budgets will become unbearable. Governments that once spoke with confidence about supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes are now facing a more uncomfortable question. How long can they support their own economies? And then there's politics. European publics are tired. The early war fervor has faded, replaced by skepticism and fatigue. In countries like Germany, France, and Italy, populist parties are capitalizing on that exhaustion. In Eastern Europe, governments that demand escalation are increasingly out of step with their populations. Without the United States to set the tone and absorb the blame, European leaders will have nowhere to hide. Every policy failure, every battlefield setback, every economic shock will land on their own desks. Their capacity to sustain the war will shrink, not just because of material constraints, but because their voters will no longer accept the cost. Russia is counting on exactly this. Its strategy has never depended on conquering all of Ukraine. It has depended on outlasting the West. And now, with the U.S. stepping back, the heaviest pressure falls squarely on Europe. Moscow knows that without American leadership, European unity will fracture along predictable lines east against west. Escalation against accommodation. Rhetoric against reality. Trump didn't just shift the military balance, he exposed the foundation of European strategy as paper-thin. Europe's leaders will soon be forced to make choices they've spent the last 2 years avoiding. Either they escalate without Washington's backing a move that would expose their weakness, or they begin the process of strategic retreat. Neither option preserves the illusion of strength they've projected until now. The burden is real. And for the first time since this war began, it belongs to Europe alone. The map of Europe is being redrawn not by treaties, but by power. Trump's withdrawal from the Ukrainian war doesn't just shift policy, it reshapes the strategic order that has defined the continent since 1945. For nearly 80 years, Europe's security has rested on the assumption of unshakable American leadership. That assumption allowed European states to neglect their own defenses, to build political narratives disconnected from hard power, and to pretend that their interests and Washington's were always aligned. That era is ending. What follows will not be a clean transition. It will be a test of whether Europe can stand as a geopolitical actor or remain a dependent bloc in a world it no longer controls. The first fault line will be between Eastern and Western Europe. The Eastern states Poland, the Baltic countries, and others view Russia as an existential threat, they will push for confrontation, increased militarization, and deeper defense integration. But without Washington at the center, their ambitions will exceed their capacity. Western Europe, led by Germany and France, uh, faces a different reality: economic fragility, energy vulnerability, and growing domestic opposition to the war. These differences will widen as the U.S. steps back, fracturing the illusion of a united Europe. What has long been held together by American leadership may soon be pulled apart by divergent strategic calculations. The second shift will occur in the balance between Europe and Russia, for Moscow. This is the outcome it has been waiting for. Russia never needed to defeat the entire Western alliance on the battlefield. It needed to outlast it. With the U.S. withdrawing, Russia faces a fragmented, weakened opponent, a Europe forced to confront its own limitations. Putin and his military leadership understand that time is now their most powerful ally. They can consolidate their territorial gains, maintain military pressure, and exploit political fractures inside Europe without escalating to a full-scale confrontation with NATO. The third and most profound change will be psychological. Europe is confronting the end of strategic dependency as it has known it for decades. It outsourced its hard security to Washington and wrapped itself in the language of shared values. That shield allowed it to avoid strategic clarity. Now, facing Russia alone, Europe must decide whether it truly wants to build the military, economic, and political strength necessary to act independently, or whether it will eventually accept a settlement on terms it would have once dismissed as unthinkable. Either path represents a break with the old order. Trump's move is not an anomaly. It reflects the deeper trajectory of American strategy. Washington is shifting its focus toward the Pacific, prioritizing its rivalry with China and domestic stability over costly commitments in Eastern Europe. The U.S. is not abandoning Europe entirely, but it is signaling that the continent will no longer be the center of gravity for American power. For European leaders who built their entire strategic worldview on U.S. protection, this is a rupture that cannot be ignored. This new strategic map is not drawn with precision. It will evolve through crises, competition, and realignments. Some European states may seek bilateral arrangements with Washington to maintain a special relationship. Others may push for a genuinely European defense structure. Still, others may begin with quiet, pragmatic accommodations with Moscow. But what will not return is the old world, the world in which Europe could speak loudly, spend little, and rely on America to hold the line. The war in Ukraine was supposed to isolate Russia. Instead, it has exposed Europe, with Washington stepping back. The European order stands alone for the first time in generations. Whether it holds or fractures will define the next era of European history. For Russia, and this is not a sudden opportunity, but a patiently earned one. For Europe, it is The moment the illusions end and reality sets in,